So I'll begin the session now. Hello, everyone. I'm Manjima Sarkar, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is graphic novels in the age of electronic media. We are honored to have with us Mr. Sarnath Banerjee, Mr. Vishwajyoti Ghosh, and Professor Randy Duncan as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Mr. Sarnath Banerjee has written 5 books of graphic fiction, starting with Corridor in 2002. In collaboration with historians, he has produced Liquid History of Vasco da Gama for the Kochi Biennial and the Pune Circle, a series of vandalized history textbooks for the Pune Biennale. For Franz Hall's museum, he produced I Got Ginger, a series of drawings and text that propose the making of an insubordinate children's book on Dutch colonialism. His billboard series, Gallery of Losers, for the 2012 London Olympics was widely displayed in East London. His last solo, The Spectral Times, exploring the idea of introducing sound into comics, took place at the Banerjee Museum. Mr. Banerjee has received the Belknap Fellowship from the History Department of Princeton 2019 and the Cast Fellowship MIT 2019 for developing the idea of theatrical lectures. Now let me introduce our second speaker. Mr. Vishwajyoti Ghosh is the author of the graphic novel Delhi Come, a political graphic novel set in the 70s, and a visual book of postcards, Times New Roman and Countryman. Mr. Ghosh is also the creator of the cartoon column Full Toss in Hindustan Times edit page every Sunday, besides his earlier columns like Backlog in Little Magazine and Acid Test in Down to Earth. His comics are regularly published in various journals and anthologies, both in India and abroad. Associated with Inverted Commas, a communications initiative, he is currently working on a mapping project in the workers' clusters of Gurgaon. As a founder member of the Power Collective, he also remains an active and dynamic participant in graphic or comics artists' collective projects and works often with graphic artists from different parts of South Asia. Now let me take the opportunity to introduce our third and final speaker for today's panel. Professor Randy Duncan is a distinguished professor and director of the Center of Comic Studies at Henderson State University. He is the co-author of The Power of Comics, History, Form and Culture, Bloomsbury 2015. He is co-editor of The Secret Origins of Comic Studies, Routledge 2017, and More Critical Approaches to Comics, Routledge 2019. Dr. Duncan is co-founder of the Comics Arts Conference and co-editor of the Routledge Advances in Comic Studies series. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. Professor Duncan, I request you to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Well, I don't know what context you want me to start off with necessarily on the idea of the graphic novel in the electronic age. But I think one of the things that is defining comics, graphic novels, the way people encounter them, is the digital aspect of comics. That more and more people are reading comics on their phones, even though I wish that wasn't the case, because I write a lot about comics form, and I feel like the comics form is lost somewhat when we see it in that format, in that size. But on the other hand, people are creating comics that are made for the phone, that are designed to fit within that size. So I really be interested in hearing what the other authors have to say, that the comics creators have to say about people reading their comics on a phone when you've designed them to be on the page and it experienced that way. So if they want to jump in on that.
Yes, sir. Do you want to conduct a discussion on this, or you want to put across your views first? Because we were wondering.
I can do that.
Yeah.
So I think that comics existing in the digital realm provide lots of opportunities. For one thing, we have more and more crowdfunding that happens through Indiegogo, GoFundMe, so allowing people to do self-publishing. You can also self-publish. You can create a comic that then you can put on Amazon or Comixology. And so it's really kind of opened up what people can do with making comics. And I think that in some ways we're in a, collectors talk about the 40s and 50s as the golden age of comics, but I think this is the real golden age because there's just more people making more good comics than ever before. I'm always amazed when my students show me web comics I've never heard of. I put it in my classes where I have an exercise where I say, share with the class some web comic you would recommend. And there's just brilliant stuff being done out there. It looks wonderful. A lot of it has serious things to say. And I hope it's finding an audience. But, what comics are today are so different. When I was growing up, it was literally those spinner racks that said, "Hey Kids Comics." And that's what you had. You had the monthly, floppy periodicals. But it is so vast now and so open to anyone who, I was going to say has a computer, but really who has a phone, because they're making comics on their phone. It's like that ad for some insurance company probably where the mom says something about a computer and the girl goes, "What's a computer?" So the technology is really evolving toward mobile consumption and mobile creation of it. And it's blending in ways that, those of us who write about comics and like to put definitions on things, it frustrates those definitions because creators don't care if it fits a definition. They want to make something interesting. And so sometimes it's a combination of essay, photojournalism, drawing, comics, all coming together and serving some purpose to tell a story or to advocate for a cause. And there's more and more, we talk about activism on social media and online, and a lot of that activism has taken the form of comics nowadays. There's people that have written about the plight of immigrants and refugees, but there are immigrants and refugees themselves who have made comics. So there are people in refugee camps who are making comics about that experience, partly for their therapeutic reasons, but partly hoping to kind of get the message out about what the conditions are there. And so it is, in some ways, frustrating for someone who's a comic scholar because I can't know about all comics. I know about 3% of comics, maybe less, nowadays. And that's been one of the great things about editing that Routledge Advances in Comic Studies series, is that we're constantly getting proposals for things that I go, oh, wow, I had no idea those kinds of comics were being made, or that was happening. And so there's comic traditions happening all over the world that are now available to people all over the world because they can be created and published digitally. So I think it is really a golden age of comics, and we kind of get beyond, comics that are the basis of all those Marvel movies, and there's so much else happening in the world.
If I could just jump in for a second. Yeah. I mean, am I audible? Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, obviously I agree with Professor Duncan that it is very interesting stage that comics is going through, particularly this opening of digital medium makes things much more available. And I was in just a couple of days back, I was in a comics, it was a opening or a kind of a conversation part of the Berlin Lit Fest. And there was a group of comic book writers who were working on very nice themes, very intimate and very diverse. Because what Professor Duncan also probably meant is there's a diversity of views and opinions that we get to see in comics, which we did not expect before. By and large, what I got from recently visiting these comic book symposiums and all that, some conversations have not changed in comics. And the issue of diversity, particularly, which Professor Duncan brought out, is one thing that has not, it seems that the comic book industry has not stepped up to the diverse voices, because it is still very European, or what is called Franco-Belgian sensibilities, and on the other hand there's the Anglo-American traditions, and there's of course Japan kind of takes care of, everybody's influenced by Japanese comics. And that was basically the general understanding, that was generally the comic book publishing world, which was what was getting published, and that's what we all read, which is why both Vishwa and I had to constantly refer our works to writers, either British writers, American writers, or the idiom was always compared with another form of another culture, another set of cultural influence that shaped comics. And to a great extent, digital world has or at least promises to cut through those red tapes of cultural red tapes, where certain kind of voices will never be heard, because the comic book industry sadly has not diversified as we expected it would, as say for example other industries such as um, uh, writing, literature for example, or music. The kind of the mixing that has happened, the different voices that have actually entered in the global concept of music or literature, has somehow not entered comics. But at the same time, the digital world has not, the problem with digital is very fast. It's not a problem necessarily, because as Professor Duncan said, for activism, for current dialogues, current discussions, it is very important to kind of have something come out immediately, whether it's a political intrigue, whether it's understanding something which is complex and is happening, complex and current. Then the digital world is, because there's no mediation of an editor. That doesn't necessarily ensure a good comics. It definitely ensures a very fast comics, and some of them are very good. And it's also Professor Duncan's nightmare, which is like the amount of the absolute flood of comics that is coming our way, which makes it also sort of, which is, I mean, some people would say they're very good because many more people are writing comics, so possibilities of like, good things coming out are more. But at the same time, there's also this sort of danger of like being flooded with like self-expression, and somewhere down there's no sort of, there's absolute, so it's a brave new world for comics, I would imagine. I mean, I would add the golden age of comics with the caveat that it is also, there's a lot of things rushing towards us, and how do we, it's a challenge of information, and how do we work towards that? That's kind of.
I will just summarize both of what both the speakers said, because my point is actually a bit of both. So I mean, at one level, it's golden age of comics, but it's also the golden age of dilemma, because now there's so much of the content that is getting created. We are living in an age of unprecedented visual content, and in a post-pandemic world, we are living, every moment we are consuming some content or the other, right? In that way, it's actually a golden age of both production and dilemma as to how to react to that material that is being created. I mean, at one level, as Professor Duncan said, that the books are being created or not being created. So what you're missing out is that the tactile experience of holding a book or an album. that's there in your library, that's there on your bookshelf, and you can refer to it at any given time, versus the digital medium which is coming out every minute. The outreach it has, it's reaching out to 10x number of people at the same time, and but it's not an album, it's not a complete, it's a 100-page book, it's just a 4 panel or something. Now, but it's reaching out xxx number of people, which the tactile book or the physical book may not be able to reach. So we are living in both the dilemmas of outreach versus content which is going to stay. The thing with digital comics is that, yes, that it is possible to make that much of content, and but it also acts that pressure that on the creator to create that much x number of content consistently every day. Now, if there's someone who's doing an Instagram series of comics, there's a certain pressure on creating one every day or one every week, and because the readership or the followership has now started forming, so now you don't want to let that steam off, so you want to create and create and create. So that is one great thing, that the content is getting more created, but what is the outreach is also not an issue. What is the conversation it's leading to is something that we have to question ourselves. I am all for digital comics. I am also creating digital comics off and on, but I'm not having that consistent pressure because I haven't started a series. But a lot of creators are in that space. So, is a digital comic good enough to create a conversation? It can be a starter, but can it lead to a proper argument which a 150-page book can? Or is it those 4 panels that's supposed to plant some germs in your head, seeds in your head, which you can now take forward and do your own thing? What is the experience that we want to create with the comics is something that we also, creators also, need to now think and debate. So I can go to a protest and I can do a 4 panel, right? But am I giving everything out about the issue? If I'm going to a fun park and I'm doing a tactical thing on what the experience is like in a comic, how is it different for the fact that I didn't do a video or a vlog there? Or why didn't I do an Instagram reel there? And what is my motivation to draw it out is something I need to be very clear about. So I think it's a bit of both that we are all dabbling with. And it's also a question of outreach. I also want readers. I also want followers. I also want people to see my work. But at the same time, will they remember it tomorrow? Is a dilemma a lot of comic creators are facing. So a lot of the web comics that is there is actually also going through this, because unless you are institutionalizing it in form of a series or something, what is the space? 15 years back, I remember in the London Lit Fest, Sarnath, if you don't remember, something called hypercomics, if you remember. So that whole concept of comics on the net, where you would it would be a quite a engaging interactive experience. So you click one button and this character goes on the right side of the page and the story takes one lead, and if you click the left button, the character goes on the left side of the page and the story takes completely different lead. But the whole thing was comics. I don't see that happening anymore, because that hyper comics is now somehow is not there in the conversation, and a lot of those creators are not creating it anymore. But web comics is similarly, a lot of web non-fiction comics is very big on the scene now. But is it leading to a bigger conversation, a bigger body of work, a bigger thing in the library of comics? Is a dilemma I'm also going through.
Can I follow up on that? I think in some ways it may sort itself out eventually, in that different types of comics will be on different sorts of platforms. So, for example, there's some people who want those little daily humorous comics. Now I'm not someone who uses TikTok and looks for that little brief video that's going to amuse me. But as one of my students was saying the other day in a presentation, he took his phone out and he said, "I have a more powerful computer than NASA had in the 60s, but I just use it for watching TikTok videos." So he was self-aware that he was not maybe getting the most out of it. But then I think that, I wish more of my students would do this, but people who do want something more serious, might find their way to things like the nib or the reviewed as an A or drawing the times, where there are political comics, activist comics, and some of them are just 4 panels, but some of them are, long scrolling panels, like that thing Scott McCloud hoped would happen. It has its place for, a daily diary comic that is just kind of taking the place of someone who made a video, who was vlogging about their life each day. Now there's people who are drawing about their life each day. James Chaka did that for a long time. And so I think that it's kind of like there's comics out there that are accessible if we know about the places for them that fit our mood. It's like, I got home, I'm tired, I just want something silly. It's early in the morning, I'm fresh, I want to think about issues, I go to these places. I think there needs to be better education about what those options are, but of course there's no one in charge of that. It's all unregulated, just happening sporadically. And I think that's a role that actually comic scholars and professors could do more with, is getting information out there about the diversity of things. I think that Rutledge series that Matt and I edit serves a purpose, but it serves a purpose to other professors and graduate students. No one, I can tell by the royalties. Not a lot of people are reading those books. So we need more people who are kind of advocates for, here's all the vast, quilt of comics that's out there, all the kinds of things that you might encounter in the places that you can find them. And then I do think that some of those, like I said, on the nib and drawing the times, do kind of start conversations, even when they're very brief comics.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly, Professor Duncan. Things will even out with time, and I would think that's probably where we're heading towards. And but it's interesting, Manjima, the question, the dilemma that Vishwa is talking about. Whose comics, and also later on followed by Professor Duncan about everybody reading different kind of comics. And so interesting question would be, and luckily for Vishwa and me, unlike Professor Duncan, we don't actually have to read all. We're not comic theorists or cultural theorists, so we don't actually need to create, know about what's actually happening around. We can talk about the comics that we do and we like and we follow or we try to do, and we can talk about the way we look at inventions in comics, which is not necessarily only web comics, because which just reminded me of some of our time, some time that we spent in London, where there was a lot of invention. There was like this electronic, analog and electronic getting together, maps of encounters, comics which are like sort of about a particular moment, but the moment has been spread out over like several pages. Then I myself tried to work with trying to bring in sound into comics, doing radio comics for Bhaudajilad, where I try to put images and sort of sound in it. Because Professor Duncan, much of in our childhood with like Vishwa and I and most of our colleagues, we don't come from very strong comic book culture. Of course, we've had like sort of local children's comics and we've had the mythological comics, etc. But we didn't come from like a comic subculture, which kind of freed us. Also, it kind of was very limiting, because we were like sort of trying to kind of invent the language as we went ahead, as we went forward. Trying to kind of grab a little bit of this, grab a little bit of that, perhaps a little bit of movies, perhaps a little bit of graphic design, trying to kind of bung it all together into like this one cuisine, which one of the advantage of that. And I think I could also think of relatable cultures, and I'm sure like Indonesia probably would have the same story, somewhere else would have, but not having, which meant that we were constantly, when we sit down on a piece of paper, there was always this invention. Every page was an invention, which is why, refreshingly, the kind of comics that I find coming out of, say, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, perhaps also Pakistan, and many other places, that there's an enormous amount of diversity of voices. So, for example, while Vishwa is trying to kind of relook at a micro historical incident, which is now, of course, becoming quite popular here also, like looking at but that historical incident was a very major historical incident that happened in the subcontinent, and it has all its play and its drama, and the way he probably had to visualize it would require a certain kind of visual language, which is not necessarily something that international comics was at that point when I'm doing it, because of just reality. And I think the way, from my own personal thing, is sort of bring the local politics, the local way of looking at things, sound, music, etc., to create like a kind of readership which kind of understands, gets a lot of joy and derives a lot of pleasure out of the same locality that, say, for example, we would when we read an Will Eisner talking about the particularities of life in New York, or the Hernandez brother talking about like a small community of post-punk or punk, that particularity. This is what I've been trying. This is not aimed at any one of us. I'm just saying that this diversity that we had so easily embraced of different ways of telling stories is the reticence of that diversity, that the reticence of accepting of that diversity by the comic book world has been like mostly what I think is one of the biggest challenges that the comic book industry faces right now. Not so much from web comics, because as you had explained, it has a different journey altogether. It talks about very different things, and similarly, and the graphic novel has its own, like, there's an editor. People look at artwork. It's introspective. It's interior. It stands time. It is durability. It's a piece of history. When you look back at it, a certain kind of culture comes back to you. So I think I'm just sort of broadening the conversation about what is the challenge of storytelling, visual storytelling, where it is heading towards. Whether it is electronic that we need to worry about, I don't think we need to worry about. As Professor Duncan said, it'll all find its own place, everything. But I'm saying that
the advantage that has happened over the time from the era that you're talking about until now is that because of the visual exposure which is there out there in the world, it's now easier and more important to acknowledge your influences in your work, right? And that is now pretty much a norm across, whether it's a digital world or the analog world. Is that how do we work with the diversity that we are all exposed to? I mean, of course, there are parts where the language is nascent, where the form is still being evolved, and of course, we are acknowledging all that we were influenced by, whether it was a mythological comic or a period film or a Marvel comic or a film from our own childhood or the community that we came from or the locality or all of that. And we were actually trying to do a potpourri when we were starting out, right? When we were doing graphic novels in India, beginning of this century. But now I think it's 10x of that, because now we are even more influenced by what Instagram is doing, what is the idiom that's happening in TikTok, what is the idiom, and we are acknowledging the fact that these influences are becoming a part of the narrative itself, right? I mean, the boy next door is a TikTok superstar, right? No one in the colony would know him 10 years back, but now, he misses TikTok for a day. There's a crowd outside his house. Are you okay? So we are living in that age. So, the fact is that it's a part of the visual culture that he and I are a part of. How do we acknowledge that, or each other? Is the journey I think we all visual forms are going through, including comics.
Mr. Banerjee was talking about localizing things, and as some of your comics do, of showing just average people, living their life and what it's like in a certain community. And well, part of life in most every community around the world now involves social media, and that's one thing we're starting to see more in comics is. I find it annoying because I didn't grow up with social media, but So the panels seem cluttered to me because there's all these little posts in panels. So even in mainstream superhero comics, they'll have superheroes who are following their social media feed as they're fighting a battle and seeing how people are commenting on it. And while I might not relate to that, people who grew up with social media, that's part of their environment. Because I can tell you in the classroom, they have a hard time not taking that phone out and seeing why it vibrated, and checking that post. So that's one of the ways that comics are localizing that universal experience of social media being part of our lives.
Mm. Mm.
As a matter of fact, comics are also borrowing and adapting from other disciplines. And I mean, for example, the whole Obama campaign was made into a graphic novel, right? I mean, the whole thing was serialized into a graphic novel. And it was actually hoping to take the argument forward. But I think in some parts it works, some parts it doesn't work. But the fact remains that comics are as flexible now to absorb from other mediums as it was as other mediums would have been taken from comics. Maybe, I don't know. What is
Do you remember? Go ahead.
I think what has gone out of the window are forms like the cartoon strip in the newspaper, for example. The syndication is happening, but it's not really in the conversation anymore.
No.
Calvin and Hobbes is not working on Instagram, for example. Still a comic strip, right?
Yeah.
Beetle Bailey is still a newspaper comic, right? So where are those cartoons? I mean, where are those? What is the space for those kind of things? Is there a Hagar the Horrible or someone on Instagram? I'm not aware of it, but I'm sure there are. I mean, your students would be able to tell you.
Right.
Right.
There's...
So I mean, it's not.
And there are lots of daily humor strips that are, before social media even, that existed as web comics. None quite as brilliant as Calvin and Hobbes yet, but but some good ones. I was going to ask
the reason for that could be actually because of the intensity of time and the quickness of it that you have to create it to keep the eyeballs. You had 20 eyeballs today, you want to make it to 21, but you can't go to 18 tomorrow. So that pressure probably,
Right. And successful newspaper comic strip artists had assistants.
Yes.
They weren't doing it by themselves once they got established because they were making enough money to pay someone to assist them. And so just the same way with the people who do manga, who turn out incredible number of pages, they have a studio. Yeah, and that goes back to when Will Eisner was doing The Spirit. He wasn't doing everything. There was a studio. Someone did the backgrounds, someone did lettering, and that's the thing about people who produce things for social media or the web. It's usually a one-person operation. And so when you are trying to do something every day by yourself, you're just not going to reach that same level of quality as someone who's got other professionals helping them. All right. I was going to ask earlier if you remember Cymbalia. It was comics created for the iPad.
Yeah.
Which I hated that didn't succeed. I thought that had real promise to do some of the things you were talking about, and Mr. Banerjee was talking about multimedia approaches, because some of it was interactive, and you could just go with the story, or you could dive down into some aspect of it more if you wanted to. There was something separate from Cymbalia that was created for the iPad. I think it was called Operation Ajax. That was about the American CIA installing the Shah of Iran, and all of what was happening behind the scenes with that. And so some of those documents have been declassified, and with that iPad comic, you could read some of those documents if you wanted to. It was also slightly animated, just a little bit of movement and some sound of like the wind blowing, and you could choose to hear the dialogue spoken, or you could just read it. And that experiment in Cymbalia, I was just so disappointed when all that kind of went away, because I thought that was
I think that was the biggest exposure. That I think that was the biggest expose, rather not exposure, of digital media. That it exposed people to the fact that the audience did not want to get engaged beyond a point. They wanted to be passive, because otherwise, Symbia or a hypercomics becomes a tactile experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, I just want to sit back. What Netflix is doing to me tonight is what comics or Instagram comics is doing to me. So I don't. I can just scroll up, read. That's about it. But I don't want to engage. So even the clicking that button to go right or to go left becomes a job. Okay. So it's not the curiosity anymore. So the Symbia thing, one of the reasons it did not work, but it was too much information for me to engage with. So we are, as humans, genetically, we are newspaper readers on the phone now. We are passive.
Yeah.
So we scroll up, scroll down, let it be. And how many I mean, we all do that. I mean, we all store phone articles on our phones that we will read to another day, right? Whether it's an editorial, whether it's and then we forget about it 4 days later, right? I mean, how many long form speeches do we really read? Similarly, it's like, okay, I want to get home, I want to sit down, have a drink. Who's going to take the laptop back or the tab back to the bed and go right, left, inside, deepen? That's probably that's the biggest learning of digital medium that's happened.
I mean, interesting that both of you are discussing that. I reminded me of the questions that Manjima had sent about digital, about what we think about electronic media and all that. Thing is, of course, what works for me would not work for other people. For me, comics is a very different thing. I mean, it's a internal enchantment exercise. When I read something, I expect to be enchanted. And the problem with the Netflix situation is that it leaves you with a sense of disenchantment, the solution of which is not another Netflix series. And people can't seem to, I mean, including me, can't seem to get over that. Like, we've now started even browsing through series. Like, we browse through headlines, just sort of see a little bit in the middle and say, oh, this is rubbish. And this is too dramatic. This is too masala. This, that. So even like Netflix is also suffering like low attention span because people just can't seem to. So, I mean, it is a fight that none of us can win of, like, eyeballs, number of followers, number of impact. These are things obvious. The most impact would be someone sitting and smiling, or just a sort of a good looking person eating a shawarma. Could always give you much more hits than, like, a month of you toiling over like a story or something like that. It's not a game. You're playing badminton with a tennis racket. It's not needed. So I think for a practitioner, Manjima, what is important is to kind of figure out where my borders are. I mean, of course, this is not to insult or undermine people who use the medium for impact. Comics is also like a very strong, medium, and particularly electronic stuff is also strong for calling out. There's a lot of calling out that happens with using the media, just like any other things. That is what gets you the most number of people. Or identity politics. It's a big thing here. Anything which is strongly identity related, with this gender, race, things that there's also an expectation as a person of color, to even by mainstream publishers, that if they are supposed to do a comic book, they have to follow their identity location. So if there's an Iraqi woman, it has to be a Muslim Iraqi woman running away from Saddam's regime. It's not to the West, and how the West has accepted her and her life in the West and the difficulties of all that sort of thing. Not like a rowing team in Baghdad, where a group of people get together and row. And that's the story that can come out from, say, somewhere in America. Or a day-to-day life of someone in Toronto who's just had a breakup going inside a tram got very beautifully crafted, wonderfully written local stuff of Canadian local stuff, the setup, the quietness, the meditativeness, the slight sterility, all brought out. And that's an amazing kind of achievement the comics language can do. It takes you there. Photographs have a lot of information, but comics actually make you feel the moment like no other photograph can. It will take you to that afternoon in Niagara Fall where you had that your Colgate toothpaste teeth out and you took a picture by some creepy uncle. So what I'm trying to say is that all that is why I am in this world of comics, is that it has opened a language for me, but it has opened other languages for me. Like I said, I am identity politics, race politics, gender politics, woke comics are there to kind of stop you from. And this is very important, where which level playing field, which is why it gets back to Professor Duncan's earlier conversation about his slight fear or hesitation about like embracing this. I mean, of course, he has embraced it, obviously, but the fact that when it went off paper to all these places, the way there were a lot of people involved in making comics. It was a crafty. It was some of the older mangas where people did most of their work together. There's also like the work of Suge, for example, Yoshiharu Suge, who did wonderful post Japan, the existential problems of a post-Japanese man, no job, nothing. That interiority that the comics could bring. Sometimes films would, they can't bring that kind of material. So I am in that world still of this thing, which is why I do digital sometimes occasionally, but only after I publish something, I kind of put something digital. I've been asked to do digital comics, and if I would probably try it out, because it's a very interesting idea that even this sort of riyaz which Vish was talking about, like coming up with the comics every day. It is almost like playing the sitar every day, and you do something and something comes out of your head, and I'm sure something nice will come out of it. That is requires very different kind of sensibility. So again, going back to what comics are we talking about is very important, and what is the where are we heading with that comics is very I think that's a very important question. And is it going to improve comic book for the next 10 years? Are we going to talk about the same things, or are we going to talk about other things? That's another thing. Because we are still talking about the same things 20 years back, sitting in Paris or in London or in New York, same conversations, little bit here and there. Is like the diversity of comics has not happened. There's been, of course, designated diversity, which means there's a real need for a Syrian comic, say, for example, in Europe right now, because there's a large number of Syrian population moving in. And usually it's not like, a day in Damascus of having ice cream and going to the zoo. It's usually like running away, Flutlinger, like, victim of something, the angry brown body. That sort of comics is almost like you're not even allowed to write that kind of comics. And that's the fact that you can write a detective story based in Vishwa's backyard with all its amazing particularities of slightly adulterous aunties and the local market and everything would find an Indian audience, which is not very big, sadly. I mean, we haven't really worked on our own readership, which is what I always thought that, you have to work on your local readership because there's no internationality. Sorry to say that.
And I think those types of comics you're talking about, are the ones that have been so critically acclaimed that aren't really graphic novels because they're memoirs, they're not fiction. But it's the ones where someone has trauma, or they have escaped from something difficult, or they're going through it still, or they're searching for their sexual identity, or so if you think about Mouse, Fun Home, Persepolis, March, which are kind of now I call the big four of graphic novels that are taught at least in the US in most English departments. They're all memoir. They're they're, all people going through difficulties. And so that's what succeeds. That's what gets taught. That's what gets prizes. And so that's kind of what people copy. And that's what publishers are looking for. They're looking for the next March, which made a good bit of money for a small comic book publisher that first undertook that. And so I think you're right that sometimes the simpler, quieter stories, people aren't rewarded for telling those in the same way as they are for telling those other kinds of stories. Not that those stories aren't important. We don't need to communicate those ideas, to talk about those situations, but comics can be more than that. One thing it made me think of is comics that do talk about problems, but very, very individual and local problems, and that are print comics. Because even though we're talking about this digital age, print comics have not gone away. So one thing that I found fascinating was World Comics India movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Even it seems like even in India, it's kind of under the radar. So a cartoonist, Sharad Sharma, had been using comics to promote literacy, but then he attended some workshops with World Comics, which had started in Finland, and was mostly going into Africa, into small communities, teaching people how to do comics, to talk about local issues. And then he's been doing that for 20 years now, I think, in India. And so there's this huge body of these, not very professional looking, sometimes stick figure kinds of comics. And he's got this format, like, do it in one page, try to tell your story. And it's everything from people who have been trying to get the word out that they don't have a good water source in their community, that they do not like, this new thing that's being built in their community, or even one that got a little bit more publicity was homeless people writing about their life. And I think some of those were collected, and then they appeared on some TV shows, and that actually started to get some changes in some communities. And then there have been some that have been combined with like larger rallies for rights for women. And I think they did like a motorcycle rally from town to town one time. And all these different little towns were doing their own comics, and sometimes they're just posting these on walls, the sides of trucks that drive around town. So it's very grassroots kinds of comics. And as far as I know, there's not really this push to share them on social media, because it's often done in communities where social media is not that much of someone's life. And so the World Comics Finland, I think, has fizzled out a little bit, but that still, as far as I know, is kind of actively going in India. And I don't know if it's happening in other nations or not, but that's an interesting phenomenon. It doesn't quite make it to the web or to social media, but still that sort of activist comics that's very local.
I think I can react to that in two parts, what both Sarnath and Professor Duncan said. I mean, in the sense that, yes, the indexes of publishing are still the same. So, yes, you need to be the sad person who's run away and not the happy person who went and had an ice cream in probably what is a conflicted country as we speak. That is, of course, there. That's the indexes that were there 25 years back are the same indexes the publishing industry would still look for a next one of the big four, as Professor said. Having said that, the space for example, the daily life when nothing really happens and life is boring in the Midwest is at one level what Chris Ware is doing with his kind of comics. But the space for an American splendor like a Harvey Peaker has actually now is the space that has actually now moved to Instagram. So probably they will not really find an audience in a printed format or like in a magazine format like American Splendor was, but it would be a daily scroll on social media and react to that and probably react with another comic that a reader creates. So there's a lot of fan fiction movement that is happening in comics making right now, where people react with another comic, which is also a great way to take the conversation forward. but that space has been taken by another form of comic in another format. Is what I observe.
Yeah. I mean, I must say that I mean there is a rich idiom in the day to day also. There are
Yeah.
rich things that come out of the day to day, and the day to day also comes out in like big topics. So, for example, some of the more interesting names that are in Indian comics, right? For example, Ikrup or Ita Malhotra or Vidyun, they are all working on again sort of like bigger like they're holding big issues, and they're working with like sort of these major intrigues, but the way they're writing is in with their own particularities. Ikrup with her own ways of like working on the visuals. Same with all Ita being out in the street sketching and things like that. So it is actually the diversity is enormous, and that gives me a lot of hope that this is going to be like a lot of, but exactly what Vishwa says, whether it's going to actually go beyond that media space, that electronic media space. Of course, these people have all come up with books, and the books are fabulously, they're very well published. I mean, they're very well produced and published. We've had also actually, Vishwa, if you remember, Manjula was like a day-to-day life of a young woman in India with all its, and it came out in a newspaper in a serialized form, and it was also very sort of very progressive for its time. And things are happening, but I mean, I like slow. I mean, slow is good because slow stays for longer. There's no rush to suddenly have millions of followers in Instagram. These are all, I mean, they are like, there's a momentary, I mean, we all have vanity, and it's a momentary but the danger is now is like when publisher starts looking at those numbers and thinking whether it's probably a good marker to index to kind of publish whether the author is fit or not based on
Well,
the person's social media possibilities.
if publishers had to look at numbers, produce graphic novels in India, then probably publishers have to look elsewhere. But in terms of the European numbers, we are still bestsellers because of the sheer demographic dividend that we live in.
Yeah. But
But
Professor Duncan must have students who also do like these sort of, there's a general slow activity happening among younger people as well. I don't know much about what younger people are up to, but I know that, I mean, I'm probably Professor Duncan would have much more, because both of you teach at universities, so you'd have a better access to what younger people are doing. But I believe I was told that a lot of people do zines, for example, which is like going back to a certain older practice of like what, say, for example, Jaime and Gilbert would do in LA. These the Hernandez brothers to kind of create these zines, staple them, and sell them at conferences. And I think people are like a lot of younger people around the town where I live are disillusioned by this sort of overt electronic kind of thing, particularly during COVID. So there's a lot of possibilities of meeting up with your wares, which is basically smaller books and zines, as a place where you can actually show the magazines, zines,
a lot
and
of
also at the
Japanese
same time,
practitioners.
talking to people, meeting people, making creating solidarities, and then they're on like putting things together, and I think that that's where the hope of comics lies, not so much in Instagram and huge followers and things like that. But that's me. I mean, I could be wrong, but
A lot of the Japanese practitioners do that. So a lot of these housewives who have a daily boring life, and the kids go to school and the husband's gone to work, they produce their little mangas and they sell them in zines and community halls. Now they could be
yeah,
doing something as diverse as gay comic, and because there's a certain market and a readership for it. So that kind of a localized experience of creating content is also happening, which is offline.
yeah,
But one point that you both said, which has actually gone out of the thing, whether it, is that, which I now think about it, is I miss probably, is that what has gone out of the window in the practice in terms of comics is the whole satire of daily life, of the middle class or the lower middle class or the common man. has now somehow gone out of the window. When we were growing up, there was a Srimati Ji or a Dabbu Ji. These were strips in magazines and newspapers which would talk about satire on daily life, whether it could be the price rise or the food shortage or something like that. That whole window has probably gone out. And it's neither on the newspaper now and neither on Instagram. That whole ability to look at one's own life and create humor about it has probably gone out of the window.
But I think some of that does exist in those mini comics that Mr. Banerjee was talking about. I said earlier I'm probably aware of 3% of comics. I should lower that to 1% or so, because I wasn't thinking about the mini comics. I went to an event in Columbus, Ohio called was Comics Crossroad Columbus, I think it is. And they have this wonderful public library there, and it's huge, and the second floor of it was given over to this convention. But it wasn't a regular comic book convention. It was mostly, was pretty much all self-published, and some of it, looked like a regular monthly issue floppy, but the majority of it was mini comics. And many of them were about that, about just, I work in a bakery. Here's some things that happen at the bakery. One man had created a comic because he had been diagnosed with cancer. He was a single father, and he had a son, I think it was like 10 or 12 or so. And he said it was just so hard on him because he thought he was going to lose me. And so what they did is they made a comic together about it, like over a year during his treatment time. And obviously he was recovered. He was there at the library. I bought one of his mini comics. They're small, and they're about $8 US dollars, which is twice the amount of a regular monthly comic. But you kind of like to support people who are engaging that sort of self-expression. And I was just amazed how many people there were there that did that. And that's just in, part of Ohio. And so I'm sure that's happening throughout the US, throughout India, throughout Africa, South America, in ways that we don't know.
Not enough in India, actually, because what is happening is, it is happening, but I think the exposure is lower, because it doesn't get picked up so easily internationally, because it is very specific. I guess that's why one doesn't get to read. Well, why do we read, Professor Duncan? Partially because it's pleasure, and as you know, when you read a good comics, it's like having an eclair, a cold eclair with hot coffee. Literally, the coldness of the eclair meets the heat of the coffee. It becomes something inside your throat, and as it goes down, you can't help but make these sounds. It's just this. And for years and years, we've all derived an enormous amount of pleasure from reading, not about like the swashbuckling nature or the narrative twists and turns or whatever, of like the details of Baker Street, London, of whatever, Midwest, so like a novel set in the American Midwest with its sort of small little rituals and things like that. Part of we're lucky because of being from a developing country. You had to make it your business to sort of know about the great world ahead, which is why we somehow managed to kind of extract an enormous amount of pleasure from, say, Prague. And when I'm talking about Michel Chabon's book of what was it called, The Escapist, can't remember right now, but anyway. The big book on comics,
Cavalier and Clay,
Cavalier and Clay.
The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
And the joy of Pekars, was it Cleveland, Daniel Klaus's some kind of a strange suburbia, or all these magical things happening. Vishwa has spent a certain amount of time in France, and French comics also had Tahdi could like create this atmosphere and tonality and stuff like that. This is why we read. We don't often like read about like kind of information. How much information am I going to extract about someone who's like sort of escaping Eritrea, or we want to know about Eritrea, like the architecture of Eritrea, what people eat and stuff like that. And unfortunately, the readership of comics, it's our fault, I guess. It's a combined fault of writers and publishers, not really created this love for this particularity, that the pleasure of somebody else's local, which is the underlying word. The same way, luckily, some of us derive a lot of pleasure, even Toronto, the local of Toronto. I can't believe I I can like and grow a certain kind of fondness for that. But Midwest or wherever, Hungary. It's not like we're international people, as we come, both Vishwa and I'm product of an India where traveling outside the country was going to traveling to moon basically. It's easier for Elon Musk to go to moon than us to go to Singapore. so we grew up with that, and that thirst for the far away, that deep desire. So I think good comics often also comes from slightly repression. I mean, repression, I'm not talking about like class, gender repression, but some kind of a repression of senses of being able to not fully able to like talk to directly to your audience, or having all the sort of normal all the technology in your hand, or the sort of iPads and stuff, like very quickly you can put in a comics and like up there, out there. It was like more like baking. You didn't know what's going to come out. And I think somewhere down the line we have to hold on to that spirit of comics. At least I or some of my colleagues are trying to hold on to that spirit of comics. And I think the future in comics is that not about so much about future stuff, technology, and things like that. I mean, that's my opinion, of course.
Did you read Day Tripper by the brothers?
Fabio, yeah.
That's a wonderful example. I think of that. I was at the time that was coming out. I read a good many mainstream comics, and I co-curated a big Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibit. So I was immersed in reading tons of Marvel comics. And so it was kind of like a palate cleanser to get an issue of Day Tripper and read. It was a nice contrast.
I haven't read it.
Experience someone else's life in a different place.
It's a fabulous one. In fact, I would still say that I think where we have not been able to convert is the audiences in terms of I think to convert a lot of readers, we also need to convert a lot of creators. So when we started with this book on partition, and we were looking for papers, many people who are PhD holders and all of that, were very wary of sharing their thesis or their findings or their opinions to be converted into a graphic novel or a comic, because it's still the perception is comics is the child or whatever, the simplistic childlike medium. But I think besides that, also what has happened is also that the transaction in India especially is still between the creator and a publisher. There's no middle way to reach out to the reader. So that's why the reason that no zines get made and being sold or having a conversation in a community hall or the street corner. So it's like, if I made this comic, I go straight to a publisher. That is the expectation of creating a comic. Now that is a huge road to travel, or a lot of distance to cover, which is why a lot of the work does not get converted easily into a cheap photocopy or a simple digital print that does the rounds, like a pamphlet would do in the 70s. A political pamphlet would do, or a newspaper clipping would do. That kind of a engagement has not happened. The other option is straight away a digital format for which you don't need a publisher, but the engagement with the audience is a different one there. That is the schism. A lot of comics and graphic novels is happening in this part of the world, at least.
Can I ask you a question about distribution in India? Because there's probably other international listeners who might not know this also. For example, in America, for a long time, Diamond Comics distributor sort of had a monopoly. And we'd gone to this system of comics were no longer at grocery stores and convenience stores. They were only in comic specialty stores. And now one distributor is the one that distributed the comics to all those shops. And so you had to get listed. Diamond had to accept you as a new publisher for you to ever reach an audience that way. So how does it work in India with distribution? And are there comic book specialty shops that are the main points of distribution or main points of sale?
To begin with, there is no specialized distribution for comics. A lot of the mainstream publishers are publishing graphic novels or republishing comics from the West in a different imprint or the same imprint, and that is getting distributed mainly through the mainstream book distributor. So there's no specialized comic distributor, number one. The distributors of particularly comic book companies, of which firms which are making comics, have their own systems in place, but they're again going through the main bookstores. So a lot of times our books are actually found in the children's section. Both Sarnath's and mine have been found in the children's section because
they're found at all.
Yeah. Now Sarnath's first book is actually talking about the sexual practices and the demystification of it. My book was a political book set in the 70s, but we were right next to a children's book comic book section, and we were just plotted there. I think the little journey that we have made is now we have a small little graphic novel desk in a bookshop.
That's good.
I think that is the little bit of distance that we have covered. Okay, but there are no comic graphic novel bookshops. There are clubs. There are clubs.
Did you get those sections in the bookstore partly because of manga? I think that's sort of what happened in the United States with bookstore chains adding a graphic novel section. Is first they had a manga section because it was very popular with American teens. It was selling well. And then they sort of added some graphic novels in that same area. And then it's grown over the years. But that was kind of the toe in the door sort of that made that happen.
No, I mean, there are very big sections on sexual practices. I would be very happy if the comics find their place rather there than the children's section. But
in fact, even manga has not taken off that much like it has taken up in Europe or US. It has not taken up that much of a space, anything.
No.
So if we have a graphic novel space, I think it's purely to do with our books or the reviews it has received. So that it has just over the time, it has taken 15 to 20 years now to have to get to that bookshelf.
Now that problem is not so much there, because you can like sort of, you have Flipkart, before we were like really
but
I was once caught in a Connaught Place bookstore when I tried to pretend as a reader looking for my own book.
We've all done that. We've all done that.
Yeah, I've gone to Galgotia. I don't know whether they still exist. And I went and I said that, have you heard of this new book, etc., etc. And the gentleman had a long conversation with me and said, yeah. And when I was about to leave, he says that, you don't worry, Mr. Banerjee, we'll stock your book. So it was very embarrassing. One of the most embarrassing moments. But, so yeah, that the problem is like also reprinting and all that. There are other technical problems of having the book alive. Pets die, books also die. So sometimes, some of the books that we'd all grown up with, for example, the books that came out when we all started, those books are unavailable. As if like, it's a brutal reshuffle, refreshment of it's like Apple. The last model doesn't work when the new model comes. So it's something that we need to work. I'm talking to my publishers. Trying to figure out a way to kind of, because new generation comes and there's new demand that appears for, particularly when there's such a small number of graphic novels that India has. And then this new generation has a new reading of the book. And that's all wonderful because, when you see them read your book in a very different way and do things with it, like, put up a theater, play, put up, or a podcast or whatever sort of a thing. And increasingly, what Vishwa was saying, taking his point about like academics who used to think that comics was somehow undermine, like whatever, it's like infradig. That problem, I don't know whether Vishwa is still facing that, but I don't think we are facing that so much anymore because you clearly, we have the pleasure and joy of having Professor Duncan, who's a unique person, obviously, but many Professor Duncan-like people in very prestigious all sorts of universities holding fantastic sort of academic positions. So, it's very much legit to do comics these days. I don't know whether it's good or bad for some of us who always like to be sort of, under the radar. But I meet a lot of comic book theorists and comic book, our friend Vishwa and my friend Paul Gravett was one of our primary, as in Germany they say Leiter, meaning the big Sherpa of comics, and putting things out together. And he still he's very prolific. He sustained blog and stuff like that. So there are all these things. So I think it's a good editing process when somebody doesn't really know about comics, but it's also like a problem because a lot of people are getting into this whole theory of comics kind of a thing, which has its consequences.
While we are from an era where reading comics, if you remember in school, was a banned process, right?
Yeah, I mean,
if you read comics in school, your parents would never try and buy you a comic, so you have to borrow it from a friend or steal it. And then if you borrow, and the reason was that it would take away your reading habit. And so then you couldn't read comics. If you got into a comic and if you were reading it under the desk in school where the class was teaching you photosynthesis, then the comics would be taken away and your parents would be called next day to a place where we're discussing graphic novels in universities. So that is a journey.
That we have successfully passed along with having a section on sexual practices in our bookshops.
I think that is still a middle ground. That
but you know what I was trying to Manjima, who's from another generation, I just wanted to say that what Vishwa is also talking about is as a degree of repression. There was always something you were stopped from doing. And Vishwa went to art school. I never went to art school, but I've always been all the things that I try to remind myself, because I have a son now. I also try to stop him from doing things that he wants to do, hoping that all the things that I stopped him from doing.
And you have the same issues with him. His parents have with you.
Yeah, the 25%, or not 25, that'll be too much. 5% of repression is very healthy, I think, to any society.
You're going to decide that because you don't want him to have one device, and while you are playing with another one. So that is
he's referring to our problem with device. I'm absolutely insane when it comes to him with device. But anyway,
what a candid conversation to be a part of, and I'm really sorry that I jumped in and I sort of interrupted. But I guess we are going to conclude our session here. And thank you for carving out the importance of electronic media and talking about comics and sharing slices of your lives, of your experiences. I wouldn't have imagined this session being so wonderful, but here we are. And with this, I would like to come to the end of this panel. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thanks to Professor Randy Duncan, Mr. Sarnath Banerjee, and Mr. Vishwajyoti Ghosh for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us and for gifting us such a delightful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It was a lot of fun. It went quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Duncan, for your time.
Thank
and
you,
Vishwa, Professor Ghosh, also for your time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take care, guys.
Very nice meeting you virtually.
Yeah, nice meeting you.
Inshallah, one day we'll all meet.
We'll all meet.
In Delhi, hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.